Well, thank you very much. It's exciting to be in Waterloo. I hope I come as Wellington rather than Napoleon. All right, so I want to talk about evolving the language-ready brain. And given our two talks this morning, I think I would position myself in between. So there'll be a little bit of single-cell stuff as a foundation, looking at the monkey, not in terms of vision and attention, but in terms of vision and the control of hand movements. And that will be the foundation level. And then when I get up to language, I will be claiming that Paul should have had it on his list of our greatest inventions, because if there is one invention that has been catalytic more than any other, I would say it was language. So I'm going to offer a chapter for Paul's next book. That is the main reason I am here. Okay. So let's start with looking at manual action and moving on to action recognition. It all started for me at a conference in 1979 when Marc Généraux, a French neuropsychologist, presented this slide. And I'll refrain from the usual joke about the French skill in teaching hands how to jump. But the crucial thing is you're seeing here stills from a person reaching to grasp this ball. And there are two things of interest here. One is that the hand pre-shapes. It's not that you get to the ball and then feel around. So visually, you're both planning what the arm is doing to get the hand in the right place, and you're planning what the hand will be shaped like so that with minimal delay, you will reach the object and grasp it. But below, we see the position of the thumb tip in successive frames of the movie. And what you should notice is that around here, there's a transition from fast movement, in other words, a long distance between successive frames, to a very slow movement. So you basically go feed forward to get almost there, and then you allow feedback to adjust that final phase. So that led me to a model. And the model is in terms of schemas. And I think the difference between me and Chris, judging from Paul's talk this morning, is that Chris is bold enough that when he's got a function, a semantic prime, he will go straight to some neurons that do it. Whereas I will say, well, here's something I would like to know how the neurons do it, but I'm not ready yet to ascribe it to particular neurons. So schema theory is my language for saying, what's a functional decomposition that can then be subject to the question, is there a localized circuit that does this, or is there many different circuits doing many different things, including implementing this function? So here was the starting point at that level, saying that, okay, so I had to have what I'll call perceptual schemas. They could look and see where the object was located, what its size was, how it was oriented. And then they fed into two schemas for motor control, one of which would make that ballistic movement of the hand to about the right place, and then the slow movement to get it just where it needed to be. And over here we had the hand pre-shape and hand rotation, and then the transition from pre-shaping the hand and orienting it to actually closing in to make contact. This was triggered by this transition over here. Now, a lot of work's been done to refine that, but before I go further, I just want to emphasize that idea that at the time this was done, it was a neuropsychological model, in which we were sure the brain had all these functions, and here was my hypothesis as of that date for how they were coordinated. But where were they in the brain? What was happening? So the turning point for that came in around 1990, where I started a collaboration with Marc Généraux. I continued, his wife, myself and my wife, Giacomo Rizzolatti. Many of you know him because his group discovered mirror neurons some years after this, and Hideo Sakata. And it was Giacomo's group and Hideo's group that had the key information about the macaque brain to carry forward what I had sketched with that schema model. So in part of the parietal cortex, in AIP, anterior intraparietal sulcus, but never mind. That's a part of the parietal lobe. what Hideo found was that neurons there seemed to respond more to how an object would be grasped rather than to what it was. So this is the sort of area that was briefly mentioned by Dr. Mansell earlier, down in the infratemporal lobe, where you might see that an object was a small sphere or a small cube. But if it was small enough, you'd grasp it the same way with a precision pinch. And so the jargon we used, borrowed from J.J. Gibson, was that of an affordance. The idea is you look at an object not in terms of what it is, but what you can do with it. And the suggestion was that for hand control, a crucial thing was what would be. Was this something you do a precision pinch for or a power grasp for, and so on. And then it was down in the premotor area, just in front of motor cortex, that Rizzolatti and his group had discovered that there were cells whose firing correlated with the type of grasp. So there might be a cell that would only fire when the monkey was doing a precision pinch. Another cell might only fire when it was doing a power grasp, and so on. Now, a lot of the conversation has been in terms of one neuron doing one thing. Actually, I think population coding must be involved, but that's more detail than I want to today. At the same meeting where I heard Genero's talk, there was a talk by Mishkin and Ungerleider on this idea of the two visual pathways. And in fact, you will have seen two visual pathways in our first talk today. And they talked about the idea that if you gave a monkey a memory task, the remembering where something was could be separated from remembering what was the cue for where to find it. The study here by Colin Ellard's advisor, Mel Goodale, and various other people, was looking instead at what impairments of the sort of action I showed you from the Genero thing. So this was some years later. So you might have, there was one woman with a brain lesion who, if you showed her cylinders, let's say, of different diameters and asked her to describe them, what the diameter was, she couldn't do that. Even if you asked her to pantomime, she couldn't do it. But if you asked her to pick the cylinder up, she would pre-shape perfectly. And then there was a person with the opposite lesion who could describe how big things were, could even pantomime how big they were, but when she reached, she couldn't use her vision to control the pre-shape, and so she would reach with an open hand and then would rely on touch to then enclose the object appropriately. So that ended up with, instead of what and where as the description, thanks to Mel Goodale and the others, we came up with the idea of a how pathway going up dorsally through parietal lobe, which would look at an object in terms of what did you need to know to interact with it, the affordances, as distinct from the infratemporal pathway coming down here, which would be what do you need to know about the object. And so that led to another model, and this model was sort of hybrid in the sense for parts of it, we felt we now had enough single-cell data from Rizzolatti and Sakata and co on to say, this part of the brain is doing this job. Here's a neural network that may not be exactly how the brain does it, but is plausibly related to the available data. And other parts were still at the stage of, well, it's up there in the front of the brain somewhere, but I'm not sure which subregions of the brain do it or how they do it. So here was the idea. You look at this, and your ventral pathway can recognize that it's a mug. Your dorsal pathway doesn't know what it is, but it can see there are various affordances, places where you could grab it. And it's not just telling you what they are, it's telling you how big they are so you could pre-shape your hand appropriately. So the notion is that the recognition of a mug can now inform the prefrontal cortex to start making some things. So for example, are you motivated by the fact that you want to drink some coffee, or are you motivated by the fact that the mug is in the way and you need to move it to get at some papers? Do you remember if there's coffee left or not? And so on. So that's the sort of thing where at the moment I can't point to specific little neural circuitry and say, this is the one that remembers whether there's still coffee there, and this is the one that informs you of whether you desperately need a shot of caffeine and so on. But the point is, these can now say, depending on that, if I just want to move the mug out of the way, maybe it's the affordance at the top, grab it by the rim. If I want to drink from it, okay, it's the affordance for the handle that's going to be crucial. And so that system then can meet. And what's interesting perhaps is that at the time, the neurophysiological data was at the level of you give a monkey one affordance, you watch him grab it, and you see what cells fire as he does it. We opened up this idea of situations with multiple affordances and the selection problem and so on. And there is a guy at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island whose name is Bub, and I desperately want to write a paper with him on our joint work by Arbib and Bub, but unfortunately we haven't got there yet. So, you know, there's still challenges ahead. Okay, now back to the single neurons again. These five people, Di Pellegrino, Fadiga, Fagasi, Gallesi, and again Giacomo Rizzolatti, had this interesting experience. I think it was Leo who was putting, so this is sort of the version. He was putting a raisin on a tray prior to handing the tray over to the monkey to get the monkey's activity, brain activity, while picking up the raisin. And as you can see from the single cell recording or the histogram of many trials, the cell started recording when the monkey saw Leo do a precision pinch of his own to place the food. And so this became very exciting, and the idea that there are cells involved in hand movements, and then there's a subset of them which will fire both when the monkey is executing the movement and when the monkey sees somebody else execute the movement. And those have become they're called mirror neurons. They're active for execution and observation of similar actions. And canonical neurons, there are many neurons that are there that fire, but without being able to observe what others are doing. Now that led to a growth industry, and a guy named Hickok in California, who didn't like the way that industry was growing, wrote a book called The Myth of Mirror Neurons. I have now written what is becoming one of my most widely cited papers called The Myth of Mirror Neurons. I'm waiting for the reply, but this is the computer science topic of recursion cropping up again. Okay, so, but what I want to emphasize as we build these brain models is that there's a lot of brain beyond mirror neurons. And I think part of the disease, which perhaps provoked Hickok to write his book, was that there are people who sort of talk as if, hey, if you've got mirror neurons, they do miracles. Anything you care to understand is there. Now, what I'm going to lead towards is the idea that mirror neurons are important for language. And I'm going to talk an evolutionary story, only part of it in the time we have together, but from the last common ancestor we have with the macaques to the last common ancestor we have with the chimpanzees, LCA-m, LCA-c, to ourselves. Now, it's pretty clear, I think, that, well, how many of you think that monkeys have language? Oh, wow. I have problems here. Okay, how complicated is their grammar? Would they understand this talk? Could they be taught to understand this talk? I think not. So in that sense, all right. So what changes? So what I want to do with the next slide is just to remind you of this idea that there's a lot more going on. So in this particular case, Bacino and his colleagues at the University of Parma, working with brain imaging people in Milano, showed people little video clips. So I've just put a still sequence in each side. So on the left side, you have a dog biting something, a monkey biting something, and a human biting something. And the claim is that there's a blob on the... that this blob remains pretty much the same throughout. So, in other words, you can map the biting of the other creatures onto your own repertoire. But on the right-hand side, the videos with no soundtrack were a human talking, a monkey communicating with facial gesture, teeth chattering, lip smacking, and a dog barking. And then you'll notice that the area for production of those, the mirror neuron area is high for length for the speech. There's a little bit left for the monkey and nothing left for the barking. But you recognize dogs barking. And so that means there must be systems beyond the mirror system for those actions that you're not mapping onto your own repertoire. Right? Mirror neurons are if it's something in your own repertoire that you recognize being performed by another. Now, actually, there's an experiment I wanted them to do, but they never did it, which was if you change the task from just looking at the videos to saying, imitate what the creature is doing, then should I ask you all to bark? No, I won't embarrass you, but the idea is you could, and then I would think in that case you would be seeing then a motor representation for your vocal apparatus, and it would look more like mirror neurons in that case. So that's the other little data point to note in this story, is that monkeys really don't imitate worth a damn. I mean, there's a bit of stuff that can be called imitation. Chimpanzees are fairly good at imitation. I'll call it simple imitation. We're really good at imitation. And the big difference between us and the monkeys is if you show monkeys stuff, they'll tend to work more on the sub-goals rather than observing the fine details of the motions required to achieve each sub-goal. So this might relate a little bit to the discussion some of us were having with Dr. Thagard earlier about composition, that the monkey sort of thinking, if I get from A to B and then from B to C, and is composing stuff described at that level, and not seeing that the getting from A to B that he uses is not going to be fine enough. So he has to find a way of being able to observe to and make use of the observed differences. My description of this is the IKEA effect. So you look at the pictures and say, oh, I can do that, and you jam this thing here and jam that thing in there, and then about 3 stages on, you've got this terrible mess, and you go back and pull things apart, and then you look carefully at the details to be able to complete the assembly. So that's the sort of difference. I mean, again, I don't know of any chimpanzees being given IKEA toolkits and asked to do it, but you get the idea. Here's a model. Again, just quickly to show that as we had more information, we both used that information as a constraint on the model, but also went further than the available work could do at that time. But I don't think I'll take much time on this except to say, I think we reinforce the idea. It's not that you come innately with circuitry for recognizing different actions. It's rather, according to our theory, that you have to carry out the actions. You recognize your hand movements relative to objects, and now that becomes available to generalize across to seeing other creatures making similar visual trajectories of the hand relative to the object. Now there's, so a learning model. The crucial observation to carry forward is that being able to recognize the actions of others doesn't mean being able to imitate them. Remember, the mantra is that you have something in your repertoire, and that's the basis for recognizing somebody else perform a similar action. Imitation is recognizing somebody do something that gets a nice reward and adding it to your repertoire. So the claim is that things had to change as we went from the last common ancestor with monkey to that with chimpanzee to be able to augment the mirror neurons beyond the mirror to get the ability for even simple imitation. Now the next point that we need to note going forward is that monkeys have a set of vocal calls that are species specific. They are innately wired. Chimpanzees, great apes generally, do have some vocalizations, but they also have manual gesture. And that manual gesture seems to be a mixture of what may be innate and what is certainly flexibly acquired through development. So I am going to be taking the position, and I'll offer just a little bit of discussion about it, which suggests that the manual gesture was more important than the species-specific calls on the evolutionary path towards language. And to augment that with one more data point is that other primates don't have much vocal control or vocal learning. So it really took a major evolutionary step to bring in a vocal system. And again, rather than go into the details, there's sort of a dispute in the field between those like myself who say, well, we had to go through getting enough manual control to make it worthwhile to, as it were, parasitize the vocal system with our manual flexibility to build flexible vocal control. And those who say, oh, well, whales have songs, birds have songs, even educated never mind. So it's easy to get a song system. So let's get a song system like everybody else did. And the trouble then is there's no meaning to it. So either way, you've got a big problem. Either, yeah, you get a vocal system like birds did, but bird song just says, mate with me or stay out of my territory, which is not really an auspicious starting place for giving a talk in Waterloo. Never mind. Okay. All right, so just a methodological interlude. What I've been doing since my time with Rizzolatti, we wrote a paper called Language Within Our Grasp, but building on that really has been to build a community of people working on macaque, working on great apes, working on humans, and to basically you go back, well, this is what this next slide says, you go back from modern macaques to say, well, what are the shared properties that we might impute to LCA-m? You look at the great apes, you say, what common properties might we impute to LCA-c? And then from that inference, we now try to add evolutionary hypotheses about what happened. And to relate that to single-cell neuroscience, we have the methodology shown here. With the monkey, we can build really detailed and realistic, relatively realistic models of how circuitry can achieve a range of functions, including the emphasis here, the manual visual ones. Now, we have work on homology and genetics that talks about homology. What areas here are related to what areas here, what new areas come in, what new connections come in. But now we can say, well, given what we know here, we can build a model. Maybe it's a composite with neural networks for some parts of it, schemas for other parts. But now we can begin to explain what the apes can do. And then we can finally, and what I'm emphasizing here is that this passage, that a lot of things, visual attention, hand movements, et cetera, where we think, okay, we share those with the other creatures. And right, the brain may change in various ways, but the fundamental computing principles remain the same. But on the other hand, adding the ability to imitate beyond the ability to recognize actions was a crucial change here. And going from there to language is a massive, massive change. So what we're going to try and do is that. The one other point I would preach today, without getting into it at all, is that a lot of the modeling is outside the cerebral cortex. We have all these areas that are so important. The hippocampus supports episodic memory and helps with navigation. Basal ganglia seem to be crucial in the scheduling of actions. Cerebellum is what allows us to move gracefully. So I just want to advertise the latest paper, the super learning hypothesis, integrating learning processes across cortex, cerebellum, and basal ganglia. Just came out in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. And then I just want to hark back to an old book with Johnson Dagatai, who is probably the greatest of the Hungarian neuroanatomists. And so we have, here's a cross-section of the hippocampus by Ramon Cajal, the greatest ever neuroanatomist perhaps, but certainly the greatest Spanish scientist of all time. And then from Sandagatai himself, cerebellum, spinal cord, and cerebral cortex. And what I want you to note just is that the cell shapes are very different, the spatial arrangement of those. And so we're beginning to sort of see why one structure might be better for certain types of computation than another. But that's a huge challenge. But the whole story I'm giving today is really at the level of, well, if you can rely on the basal ganglia to do the scheduling, and if you can rely on the cerebellum to make it graceful, and hey, the hippocampus is helping create the episodic memories you're building on, then how does the cortex do it? Okay, so from manual action and recognition to proto-sign. Now here's the next debate. If you believe Noam Chomsky, you will believe that there was a magical mutation somewhere in the last million years or so that gave you something called merge, and you went from creatures without language to creatures with language. And I have a whole talk on why that is total rubbish. But so my doctrine of the language-ready brain goes like this, that, well, very simply, it's that we, our ancient ancestors 200, 250,000 years ago, the early Homo sapiens, had a brain that was language ready. Now, what do I mean by that? I think the easiest analogy is that, think of the reading ready brain. I think we all agree that we did not evolve to be able to read. The brain did not evolve. It was a cultural evolution that rested on top of spoken language. But if you go to the brain and you image the brain of somebody who can read from somebody who can't, it's different. But that's not because they're genetically different. It's just because of their experience. So the jargon that's been used for a long time is evo-devo, that we evolve the way we can develop. And now I would add, as others have been doing, the third term, socio, to say you evolve so you can develop, but the way you develop will be shaped by the society you're in, and you in turn then may be one of the people who contribute through your creativity to the further development of that society, which will then change the development of future generations. So I will be using proto-sign and proto-speech to say what are the communicative strategies that go beyond the flexibility of vocal calls and ape gestures, but got us to the stage of having a brain that maybe 100,000 years later could culturally be shaped by language, but was not there yet. So all right, I think I've covered all that. So let's just look at the next data point. This is the one that Rizzolatti and I talked about in our paper, and that was that if you do homology, then area F5, the one where Rizzolatti's group found the mirror neurons in the macaque, seems to be homologous to, giving away all my secrets, that it seems to be homologous to Broca's area, which is, or part of Broca's area, area 44, part of the speech area of humans. And that's strange. So here we've got an area that in the macaque is involved in hand movements, and yet we're trying to say it's related to an area that's a speech area? How can that be? Well, fortunately, I had got to know Ursula Bellugi, who was a linguist, and with her husband, they wrote the first book to treat American Sign Language as a human language rather than a bunch of gestures, and give it a grammar and show that it really was a full, well, I guess the deaf people already knew that, but the academics were sort of behind them. And then she and Howard Poisner, Ed Kleem is her husband, did a study on aphasia. So they found some people who were native signers of sign language. So this is an interesting linguistic question I have, is we talk about somebody's mother tongue. So should we refer to that as their mother hand? I haven't got a ruling on that yet. But anyway, so these were people whose mother hand was, in one case, American Sign Language, another subject, it was British Sign Language. But they had a lesion around Broca's area where a speaker would have aphasia, and then they had sign language aphasia. So, for example, there was one guy who could not come up with the signs of his American Sign Language, But if he wanted to get across the word fly, he would zoom around like this and get it across by pantomime. So he had pantomime, but he didn't have language. Interesting. So there's a lot more detail there. Just for those of you who are not familiar with sign language, here's just one example. So she makes the sign for a house, and then she uses this hand not to mean anything. It's just say, imagine the house is here. And then she makes the sign for bicycle, and then she puts it there. And now you, by remembering that spatial relationship, get the message the bike is near the house. But there's no word for near. So it just shows it's a rich language. You can express all these meanings, but the grammar and the lexicon are very much different. Okay? But that's just to get that idea across. So this is why we felt fairly happy with this body of evidence to say, let's look seriously, as other people had done, at the notion that manual gesture was the crucial stepping stone on the way to language, rather than expanding the vocal calls of the monkey as being the path. And as I said, it's still controversial, but I think it's quite a good story. So our paper came out in 89, I think. 2012 was, I mean, you know, it's apparently done here to advertise one's books, so I thought I'd join Paul. I'm only going to advertise, I think, one book today, but no, this is the second, isn't it? I apologize. All right, so brain and language was sort of, most of what I'll be saying is there, except for the more details of the modeling underlying it. So to get more of a sense of the modeling, there's towards a computational comparative neuroprimatology that came out 3 years ago. Okay, so here is the whole theory on one slide. And I have to go out and buy the book and read the whole thing, right? Okay, a word. All right, so the idea is that what you had shared with the LCA-m, the last common ancestor with the monkeys, was manual skill and a mirror system, the ability to recognize the skills of others, and an innate vocal call repertoire, but almost no vocal learning. Move on to the data from the great apes. We come up with apes. We get the idea they do begin to have some more imitation, though with the IKEA effect in play. And they make a lot of use of manual gesture for communication, and there's good evidence that some of those are learned. So that gets us to last common ancestor maybe 5 million years ago. And then what I'm claiming is that first we had that ability to recognize complex patterns of behavior, where we would pay attention not only to what was achieved with various parts of the behavior, but also some of the motoric details of what it took to get from one part to another. So that's complex action recognition. And then, and I'm not going to be able to get into all the details, but then the idea is that you can play that two ways. One is to recognize what somebody else is doing just for recognition's sake, or it can be the basis for your beginning to imitate it. So if we think about fast forward, a modern child exploits those, both the action recognition and the imitation, to acquire language. But when we use language as adults, we're most of the time just recognizing the complex behaviors in terms of we're recognizing the words and how they're fitted together, and that way we can recognize, hopefully, the meaning of what is being said. But we don't very often spend our time imitating what another person is doing. Maybe if we meet somebody with a name with a strange pronunciation, we'll get back to imitation then, or if we hear a fancy new word and we find out what it means, we'll learn how to say that word. But that becomes the exception as we're adults. So that's the first point. Then pantomime. Now, this is what I think is the interesting point, is that when I talked about that model of the mirror system in the macaque, if you remember, the thing that I said the monkey was recognizing was, here's an object, here's a hand movement, and the monkey learned to recognize how its hand movement related to the object as it was carrying out a particular skill. But then the idea was, once it's got that idea of how is the hand moving relative to an object, it could then generalize that from different perspectives to recognize what other people were doing, assuming that that trajectory on that sort of object had the same purpose, was the same behavior that you engaged in when you did that. So pantomime is a breakthrough, and I'm going to just give you a taste of it. I can't tell you very much in our time together. I don't have very good models for it, but if I do this, I mean, what do you think I'm trying to convey to you? Yeah, drinking from a cup, right? Here's my favorite. What? Fly, bird, flying bird. Turn up the air conditioning. All right, so, but the point about pantomime is you break from a system where you must see the relation of the hand to the object to being able to go from the movement alone to inferring what the likely object is, to inferring what in the present context that performance means. So does it mean I'd like some coffee, or does it mean would you like me to give you a cup of coffee? Or it could mean other things. Similarly, if we adopted, well, actually, I can do this from American Sign Language. My accent's very bad. Okay. So you make this sort of hand shape, sort of the body of a plane and the wings. And if you do the extended movement, that means flying. And if you shake it in place, that means plane. So you've said, here I had a pantomime where it's ambiguous. Is it the plane? Is it the flying? Is it the plane flying? And then you make a conventionalization, right? A community has to agree that when you do this, that means, well, in those days, I must tell you, those of you who are young and don't know your history very well, they didn't have planes at the time I'm... But you get the idea that it requires a conventionalization. So the gain is you now have a much more economical way of getting your meaning across with less ambiguity. The price is you limit the group of people with whom you can communicate. So that's what I mean by the transition from pantomime to proto-sign, where you go from just pantomiming something and hoping that people can map it onto their own repertoire, even though the objects are not there to get what it is, to where you do something. And of course, that can then become reduced. And still, in that community, it will be meaningful. So then this is where the controversy comes. I claim that it's once you had the ability to put novel gestures together to convey meanings, there was now a selection pressure for transferring that control mechanism from the manual system to the vocal system. The vocal system was there, the auditory system was there, but the control of flexible utterances was not. So that's I would say if you took a vote of people in the language evolution community, they would go for, oh, just build the vocal tract and then add meaning. But there are a few true believers who believe that meaning came first and vocalization came. Right. And then the idea, as I've said, is that at this stage we have early humans. They can communicate fairly well with a number of proto-signs, and both spoken and manual. But the claim is they don't have grammar. They probably have very limited set of communications about things like making fires and cooking, for example. They can't talk about cubism yet. And so what's missing? Well, there's basically, on the one hand, getting the idea that, hey, I can invent a new word for anything. That's a breakthrough. But the other is the idea I can put words together to convey meaning. And I just don't have time to give you my arguments as to how that might have happened. But let me just go to this transition from ape to monkey with one example. So the models of the brain I've talked about so far are all models of a single brain, and you look at how it matches input and output and changes over time. So what's interesting in this case is to extend it to what happens if you put two creatures in interaction with each other. And now the behavior of the one becomes the input to the other. And as they go back and forth, things will change. So we introduced what we call dyadic brain modeling. In other words, we set up 2 brain models, 2 body models, and then we routed the body actions as the input to the other brain model and so on. And the example that I'm going to take you to is something observed by Tomasello and Cole, who are amongst those who claim that, yeah, apes do come up with new gestures. And one of the mechanisms they come up with is what they call ontogenetic ritualization. So rather than read the definition to you, I will just show you the idea that a child wants to be hugged by mother, very touching picture, and reaches out and grabs her by the arm, and mother is pretty stupid because it takes a big tug to start pulling her towards the child before she finally gets the message and reaches out and hugs the child. But eventually, it's just enough for the child to touch her arm without the tugging for her to get the message, oh, you want a hug? And then it gets to the stage where it's just enough for him to start the movement towards her upper arm, and she responds. And finally, he doesn't even try to do the tug and terminate it. He just has that truncated behavior. And so we came up with a computer model. I'm not going to show you the details, but I will just show you a simulation of this is not consecutive stages, but this is just, well, I was going to show you a simulation. Nobody's meant to actually have a lecture go through okay, right? Well, it worked before. Never mind. Anyway, it's a very touching movie of 2 stick figure apes interacting with each other. You would probably cry if you saw it. It's so beautiful. Okay. Anyway, so just to finish this a little bit, after the disappointing demonstration, why don't monkeys have ontogenetic ritualization? The suspicion is that it's because the ape can rely much more on proprioceptive signals. This is where my arm is, rather than the visual signal about where am I relative to the object. And that supports the transition from a transitive behavior based on relation to action, to objects, to an intransitive behavior where you don't need, so you no longer need the mother's arm to anchor your behavior. You just know that if I do this, that's enough to get her to respond. The sad news is that there was some related data on the mirror system in macaques, chimpanzees, and humans using diffusion tensor imaging. But I think the last few years have meant no more diffusion tensor imaging in chimpanzees. So we will be jumping straight from the macaque to the human in future, I think. No? Yes? Sad. All right. So now, how's my time? Yeah, okay, I promise. What time's the next talk? Yeah. No, I won't do that. So now I've been sort of working from the monkey-like creature towards the human, to giving you some sense of how we can blend behavior and ethology and neural studies. Now I want to jump to the other end and look at a very simplistic but interesting model of brain and language. Now, a lot of work on language is looking at strings of words and trying to understand some abstract properties, what makes those strings of words count as sentences of a particular language. And I want to instead, as of course other people have done, stress the aboutness of language. What makes language work is because we can use it to refer in the first place to the external world. And of course, from there, we can go to counterfactuals and so on, but primarily to start with. So the model that I'm going to come up with has nothing to say about speaking or signing. It just says how, if I look at a visual scene, can I figure out what words are appropriate to describing the scene and to invoke constructions. These are sort of mini rules of grammar to put them together to be able to come up with a description. So I'm just going to do a little experiment. I'm going to show you a picture for 4 seconds, and I want you to, in your head, come up with a sentence to describe what you see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, a description from somebody who hasn't seen the slide before. Paul?
The runner fell down.
Yeah, a runner fell down. Okay, any further information? Yeah?
The runners, one was trying to jump to avoid her and also had a knee brace on.
Okay.
There were people in the audience.
Yep, that's true. So you can keep adding detail, but let's stick with the middle of the scene, although, yeah, you might say that. But all right, how many people noticed that the person who'd fallen down had an artificial leg? Okay, about 59.6%. All right, how many of you noticed all 3 runners had artificial legs? Okay, so I'd say we're down to 10%. So the only point about that demonstration is just, and the observation about the audience is important too, is that given time, of course, hey, we get back to the first lecture. Our attention can begin to fill in more and more, and then we can build a representation of some kind in our heads. And this is just to let you see the 3 legs and the 3 artificial legs. So this is a problem in visual neuroscience at the moment, is that, as we saw so beautifully in the first talk, we're beginning to learn more and more about the subtleties of low-level vision. But we're still very ignorant of the neural network mechanisms of high-level vision. So the first slide is that you can process a visual scene, and you can grow regions in terms of texture, you can grow edges in terms of contrast and so on. And you can come up with a first pass of low-level vision where you can sort of say, well, here are my candidates for regions of interest in the visual scene. And you can add things like, well, size, shape, color, texture, and if you're using 2 eyes, depth, and if you're using 3 eyes, motion. But the part where we move from, I think, detailed neurophysiology to artificial intelligence, if you like, is when we go up to how do we recognize a visual scene. So this Hansen and Reisman, this is already frighteningly 40 years ago, had a scene understanding system where they took my idea of schemas and implemented it for analyzing a visual scene. So the idea is you'd have something like, okay, with the collection of scenes they were using, outdoor suburban scenes in New England, if you have a large region that's bluish or grayish at the top of the image, that's probably sky. In Los Angeles, we had to adapt that to including brownish. Now, a region like this, which is high in the image and large and had the right color, well, it could be sky, but it's less likely to be sky. On the other hand, it has a certain shape and has the right spatial relationship with sky that it's a good bet it's roof. And so what we've got here is not just that we have perceptual schemas for sky versus roof versus wall versus shutter versus lawn versus trees, but also we have to have multiple instances of the schema. So this particular stage, we have a low confidence instance of the sky schema here, and we have a high confidence there. And so the work of the algorithm was to implement those schemas in such a way that those who were consistent with each other would, as it were, gang up to raise each other's confidence levels and to push down the confidence levels of those they disagreed with, to in the end come up with this particular interpretation. The other thing that's interesting is that this edge was missing in the original segmentation. So this again directed attention. Oh, here's sky, here's wall. Ah, there's nothing between them. So look, and then you confirm that there's a low confidence edge that would have just messed everything up if you'd looked at it early, but was very helpful when you looked at it late. So this rather daunting schematic is just to make the idea that you've got an image, you begin to group it into different pieces, and then different schemas will spawn instances that will attach themselves to different parts of the scene and then compete and cooperate, raising and lowering their confidence levels until finally you read out from the scene what you've got. So I now want to suggest that we can evolve from this structure a language structure. And so the crucial bridge was the idea that you've got vision. Now this has got all these objects scattered around. They have different location, different shape, different color. There are many, many things you might want to describe about it. So the issue is when you describe, you're going to pull out just aspects of those schemas that are relevant to the description. So the semrep, our semantic representation, is what pulls it out. And just to give you a sense of that, here's a slide from a Korean TV show. I was working with a Korean student at the time, Jin Yong Lee. And again, as you noted, you can look at the background and suddenly notice a lot of things going on, but your immediate attention is drawn to this woman who is apparently not very happy with what the young man is doing. And so from this, we pulled out as a sort of a graph-like structure to say, well, the key action here is hitting, the patient is the man, the agent is the woman. According to my student, she's pretty, and she's wearing a dress, and the dress is blue. Now, the point is, firstly, just based on our early experiment, there are any number of other things that could have been attended to there and deemed worthy of description. But this was what is pulled out. And then the next thing is that you can describe it in many different ways. So if you use the relative clause construction, for example, you might come up with the woman who is wearing a blue dress is hitting a man. You could use the active or the passive. But what I thought was particularly interesting was this idiosyncratic construction we have in English, and probably quite a few other languages, of person in color. So you say the woman in blue is hitting a man, and you don't think for a moment she's standing in a pool of blue paint or anything of that kind. You know it means that there's a garment she's wearing, but I don't need to tell you what the garment is. I just want you to recognize her because she's in blue, in a blue garment. And it's that one who's hitting the man. So this idea you've got now, instead of a visual scene with lots of perceptual schemas setting up instances to compete for different parts of the scene until they reach a coherent structure, the idea is that now the theory posits that you have, here's the story we talked about before, and now you get the semantic representation. And now it's constructions thought of as schemas are part of the grammar. They are now deployed to compete and cooperate to come up with a satisfactory description of the scene. So in the particular case we showed before, maybe you're thinking, I want to draw attention to that woman in blue in my description, and then maybe you become fascinated by what she's wearing, in which case you're going to say the woman who's wearing a blue dress, or you're just trying to say, hey, that's the outstanding feature, the fact that her clothing's blue, and you use the woman in blue. So things are competing. Passive versus active can compete and so on. Okay, well, I'm pushing my luck. I have 2 minutes left. So let me just tell you what these remaining slides are about. Isn't it fascinating? So, okay, so this is sort of if you're really interested, send me email. But so here's the idea, is that this, back from the good old days of diffusion tensor imaging comparatively, Rilling and his colleagues at Emory University looked at a particular tract, the arcuate fasciculus, that in the human, as shown it right, is this massive dorsal tract that's very much implicated in language. And then they imaged the corresponding tract in the chimpanzee and the macaque. And so you see it's much less pronounced in the chimpanzee, even less pronounced in the macaque. So it suggests an evolutionary path from our last common ancestor with a monkey, a small one to a bigger one to a huge one. Now, many people look at this and say, well, you know, the ventral path doesn't change all that much, the one that's involved in recognizing objects and so on, and recognizing actions beyond the mirror. But the arcuate fasciculus really changes, so therefore it must be the key to language. And to avoid all the details I was going to share with you, my argument is skeptical because I think two things. One is macaques and chimpanzees don't have language, so what was it doing there if it's just doing language? So if you think of it as a system that in the first place was there to control refined hand movements, and then in the chimpanzee it had to evolve to support more refined control of the hands, including control for gesture as well as practical action. And then in humans, the point is you're not only continuing to support more sophisticated imitation and pay attention to the motoric details, but you're adding a whole new modality. You're going from a vocal tract that's basically subcortical to vocal control that requires it. So I think this is at least consistent with the story I've been telling you of having a vocal system built on top of a manual system rather than evolve as a separate story. So I'll close with one more ad. I had a group of people come together in La Jolla in 2017 to basically look at my thesis of how the brain got language and do their best to criticize it. And they did a pretty good job. But they came from sign language, they came from chimpanzee behavior, they came from ape behavior. A woman from just down the road at York University, Anne Russin, spends months every year consorting with orangutans in Borneo. And she came back with a video clip of an orangutan who had seen a woman combing her hair the day before. The orangutan was going like this to implore her to demonstrate combing her long hair again. So she and I are engaged in a good debate about, was pantomime really there in the great apes, or is it really an evolutionary advance? But that's it. And hey, I'm on time. Thank you very much.
Excellent talk, Michael. Quick question. Why shouldn't the two have evolved in parallel and cross-fertilized? For example, a very simple thing, if you have some vocal variability, is to make a sound like meow. And then with pointing and with other things, you perhaps relate that to the animal. And also this, of course, would relate, I think, to a different species, Pepperberg's African gray.
Well, the African gray is a bird.
Yes,
and so we know that birds evolved some measure of vocal control. What's interesting is about the bird is, of course, that it can be trained. I mean, incredibly painstakingly. It's apparently even worse than having a PhD student to come up with simple answers to basic questions about color and number. But so that's saying you have a bird brain that evolved, and again, if you provide a society, in this case Irene Pepperberg, that is prepared to train you, excruciatingly long, you can get the system to do things it couldn't do otherwise. Now, we know that with apes, the original attempts were to teach them to speak, and it was absolutely impossible. And then somebody said, let's teach them sign language. We got to the stage, them, got to the stage where they could get them to learn perhaps 100 signs and use them, but they never got syntax, the idea of putting words together. I mean, one exception that's talked about as well, I think it was Kanzi, who was a bonobo, saw a duck and said bird, or signed bird and water. And somebody got very excited, but to my mind, well, that's just two separate utterances. One commenting on the bird, the other commenting on the water. There's no evidence that this is the beginning of a general capacity to come up with adjectives, for example. So I think that's where we are. So I think that there's nothing to preclude getting some progress towards vocal control separately. But I think nonetheless the fact that we already had animals with great manual dexterity, manual communication, suggests that at least that was perhaps ahead in the race. And so a theory in which you get a sort of scaffolding from proto-sign to proto-speech rather than the other way around, is saying, well, proto-speech is what it was all about, seems to me to have a lot of plausibility. But I am not without my critics.
Maybe, there's one more question. We take one in sort of the general forum here, and then invite folks down while the rest of us take a stretch. So we'll take one more question here, and then when this one's over, we'll sort of pause. Any of you still want to have some questions for Professor Arbib, come on down, and then our next talk will start at 3.
Okay, you showed that other primates are pretty good at manual control and even learning imitation with the chimps, as are humans. So why are, if our language is founded on that, why did we move away? Why did we go towards vocal? Why aren't we still primarily signing? There are humans using American Sign Language, but why isn't this the main communicative method for humans?
Well, there are a lot of arguments. Michael Corbelis, for example, from New Zealand, has pointed out that if your hands are engaged in doing something, it's helpful to have voice. If you're in the dark, it's helpful to have voice. If your back's turned, it's helpful to have voice. On the other hand, people I've talked to in the sign language community who are insistent that they can use tools and sign about them say, meh. So it's, again, it's a gray area where there's controversy. But it's the other way around. You know, you can say to the other people, you say, well, you know, if you have vocal control, why would you come up with manual control? Let me just say one more thing that I think is very interesting about that, is that all of us have visual language, namely writing or typing, right? We can read. But that's parasitic on vocal language. It's very, very hard and very, very rare to teach people to use written language without teaching them a spoken language. Deaf kids pick up sign language as easily as hearing kids pick up spoken language. And then, of course, they have the double problem of learning a foreign language, namely English or whatever, and learning how to write it. And that's a really long and tough process for them. So this issue of when is something easy for a brain to acquire versus, well, over several years, versus very complicated to acquire as something parasitic, that's, I think, an interesting question. So yeah, this whole thing about voice versus hand is really controversial at the moment. And as I say, I think the vote would be sort of 72 to 28 against me. But
you presented all this evidence. So.
Well, one of the interesting things is the people who argue against me ignore the point about meaning. They say, well, look, you know, these other creatures can get vocal control. Maybe the Neanderthals learned how to hum. And then, you know, once they could hum, it was a short step towards having speech control. But where does meaning come in? I don't think they've given as convincing an explanation of meaning as I've been able to with building Pantomime on top of manual control and building proto-sign on top of Pantomime. So we'll come back in 30 years and we'll see how it works out.
So we'll use that to thank Dr. Arbib again.